It all started one drab Tuesday when I found myself somewhere I'd never been before. I just dropped one of our more insufferable clients off at the airport, having endured his nonstop griping all morning, and figured I could afford a little time away from the office. The thought of slogging through another afternoon of contract reviews didn't exactly thrill me, so instead, I decided to pull into a tired-looking bar and grill about a mile from the airport. My plan was simple. I'd unwind with a decent lunch and a couple of beers before bracing myself for another few hours back at the grind. Settling into a booth, savoring my drink, and trying not to set my burger expectations too high, my attention got pulled in a completely unexpected direction. A couple walked in, a striking blonde woman in a tight, pink top and short skirt that showed off her legs, along with a guy trying way too hard to look tough in skinny jeans and a leather jacket. They slid into a booth not far from mine, sitting side by side, clearly feeling pretty cozy. I almost didn't register it right away, but then it hit me. The woman was Jenna, my sister-in-law, and the guy beside her wasn't my brother, Ryan. To say I was shocked would be an understatement. Watching them, it was clear they weren't just friends out for lunch. They ordered drinks and immediately started making out, right there in the booth, with the guy's hand wandering up her thigh, Jenna leaning back and sighing. Right then, I knew I couldn't just ignore this. I was too furious, too disgusted. The only question was whether I'd be able to keep myself from storming over there and causing a scene. I disliked Jenna from the start, back when Ryan had just started dating her. My brother, only 23 at the time, had been head over heels for her, announcing they were getting married just 4 months in. He hadn't seen what I saw, a shallow, selfish girl who just didn't measure up to him in any way. But to him, she was everything, and from the looks of it, that's all she wanted. Someone who'd do anything for her. Surprisingly, their first 3 years together seemed happy enough, but what I was witnessing now made it clear those days were over. Now, her friend had his arm around her waist, his face buried in her neck. She had her eyes closed, completely oblivious as I got up and strolled right over. I slid into the seat across from them, casually greeting Jenna. She snapped out of her daze, eyes flying open, while her boyfriend jerked his hands away, glaring at me. Jenna looked totally stunned, her face shifting from surprise to shock, her jaw practically hitting the floor. With an unnervingly polite tone, I asked her how she'd been and threw in a question about Ryan, all while extending my hand to her so-called friend. I introduced myself as Ethan, Ryan's brother, and I don't think the guy knew how to react. He just froze, ignoring my hand. Jenna, scrambling, started babbling something about Caleb being an old friend. I just smiled and mentioned the compromising position they'd been in, making it clear I'd seen everything. Jenna was practically gasping, clearly desperate for me to believe otherwise, but Caleb was already bolting, mumbling something before hurrying out the door without a single look back. With Caleb gone, I leaned back, letting Jenna stew in her own panic for a bit. I mentioned that Caleb seemed like a nice guy, and couldn't help but ask why he'd run out so suddenly. Inside, I was seething. The way my brother, a good guy who'd done everything for Jenna, was being treated made my blood boil. Quietly, I let her know just what I thought of her actions, making sure she understood that Ryan adored her, and that he'd have done anything to keep her happy. But apparently, that wasn't enough for her, since she was busy fooling around with a guy who looked like a second-rate thug. Jenna's face went pale as I spoke, her eyes darting around, desperate. She stammered out some nonsense, her words trailing off. I watched her for a while, unable to keep my anger in check any longer. I asked her bluntly how long this had been going on and if there were others. She grabbed my hand, practically begging me not to tell Ryan. I sat there, thinking about my next move, considering whether Ryan deserved to know what kind of woman he was really married to. Pulling my hand away, I leaned back, watching her closely, curious what she'd offer to keep my mouth shut. After a few moments, she composed herself a bit, her expression shifting as she made some kind of plan. She swore she'd come clean with me, claiming she had something I needed to hear. Apparently, some other woman I'd been seeing had been cheating on me too. I laughed at the ridiculousness of it, but she just looked at me, dead serious, saying she wasn't kidding. According to Jenna, this so-called affair between my wife and some guy at the health club had been going on for at least a couple of weeks. I felt a chill run through me at her certainty, even though I found the claim hard to believe. My wife and I had been together a full decade, with 7 of those years spent as a happily married couple. She was grounded, thoughtful, and absolutely honest. The kind of person who wouldn't have it in her to lie, let alone cheat. I was as sure of her love for me as I was of my own feelings for her. Sensing my disbelief, Jenna leaned in, insisting she wasn't lying. She claimed my wife had confided in her just the week before, revealing the affair. I stared at Jenna, struggling to think straight. While she'd initially seemed shaken, she now appeared composed, like she was genuinely sharing something important, not just making up an excuse to save her own skin. For a moment, her calm made me question my assumptions. Still, based on Jenna's recent behavior, I couldn't shake the idea that this might all just be another ploy. Sitting there, I kept my face blank, refusing to let Jenna see my real intentions. I already knew that protecting her infidelity from Ryan was off the table. I couldn't just stand by. Still, I wanted to dig a bit deeper into what she was telling me. Slowly, I suggested we might come to an agreement. After some thought, I told her I wasn't about to let myself be fooled by my own wife, and proposed a deal. If Jenna helped me get to the bottom of what was really going on, I'd consider not telling Ryan about what I'd seen. I only had one condition. She had to promise never to see Caleb or any other guy again. Relief washed over her face, and she eagerly swore to it, even asking if that was enough to satisfy me. I still doubted her word, but I went along for now. I asked her what exactly she'd be willing to do to prove she was serious. I proposed an idea. If she'd use a tape recorder in her apartment and invite my wife over, they could talk over some wine, and Jenna might be able to prompt my wife into admitting details of any supposed affair. I wanted to know everything: who the guy was, how it started, how often they'd met, and, most importantly, why she'd do it. As I explained the plan, I began to wonder if I could actually believe Jenna's story, which only made me angrier. Jenna agreed, nodding, saying she could make it happen. She even suggested she could start the conversation by hinting about my own affair, to make it sound like they were sharing secrets. I shot back sarcastically, asking if Caleb was her only guy, or if there were others she hadn't mentioned. She denied it quickly, but I wasn't convinced. About 20 minutes later, I was back in my car, driving to the office, my thoughts swirling around 2 marriages potentially about to unravel. Ryan's and, as much as I hated to admit it, maybe even my own. My first impulse had been to call Ryan right then and there to tell him everything about what I just witnessed Jenna doing. But I held off, realizing that without concrete proof, he might not believe me. I'd always been the steady, responsible older brother, while Ryan was the friendly, outgoing one who dated around quite a bit. But since Jenna came into his life, he'd been a changed man, almost like a smitten teenager. He thought she was perfect, and I knew nothing short of undeniable evidence would shake his faith in her. Despite my hopes that Jenna might be wrong or just lying out of desperation, I couldn't ignore the idea gnawing at me that she might be telling the truth about my wife. Sure, she could have made the whole thing up to keep me quiet, but if that were true, what would I do if it all unraveled and proved to be a cruel joke? When I got to the office, I found myself grabbing a pad of paper and jotting down a list of what I'd need to do if it turned out my marriage was ending. Things like dealing with the house, credit cards, and car titles. Deep down, I hoped I'd be able to toss that list in a few days and never look at it again. Later that night, I came home to the usual warm welcome. There she was, smiling as she set the table, coming over to give me a hug and a kiss like the devoted wife I'd always known. I returned the gesture, but I felt my heart sink. Even with the doubts and suspicions swirling around in my mind, I knew I had to keep acting like everything was fine. Beneath it all, a mix of anger and sadness festered, and I didn't know how to handle it. We had our usual easy conversation during dinner, but when she casually mentioned her workout at the health club, something inside me snapped, and I couldn't resist probing a bit. I made a playful comment about her new dedication to working out, asking if the gym had started handing out free ice cream. She laughed it off, though I noticed a slight blush creep up her cheeks. She explained she'd just been enjoying the post-workout high, and the feeling of coming home to me afterward. Then, She mentioned that the black slacks I liked had been getting snug a few weeks back, but now they fit perfectly again. She smiled at me, her eyes full of affection, and in that moment, despite my doubts and suspicions, I found myself reminded of how much I loved her. Even with everything Jenna had told me, it was hard to imagine my wife, someone I saw as honest and loyal, being unfaithful. If she was really cheating, I felt torn, trapped between my love for her and the sinking feeling that I might be betrayed. Officially, my marriage fell apart exactly 1 week later, another Tuesday. By then, Jenna and I had everything set up. I'd given her a small recorder to tuck away in her living room, and she arranged for my wife to come over for lunch on her day off. With Jenna unemployed, she spent the entire afternoon keeping me in suspense as I sat in my office, trying to focus on work but constantly wondering what the two of them were talking about and how it could change my life. Around 4:30, Jenna finally called, her voice a little tipsy, and let me know that Sarah had left. My stomach twisted as I asked if Sarah had actually confessed. Jenna giggled and told me that she'd spilled the beans about Caleb, which prompted Sarah to share details about her own friend, some big guy named Liam. Realizing I was clutching the phone so hard my fingers were numb, I told Jenna I'd be there in 20 minutes. When I arrived at her apartment, she handed me the recorder at the door, reminding me of my promise to keep things quiet. I reassured her that Ryan wouldn't hear a word, but I warned her to make sure Sarah never found out about the tape. If she did, I knew she'd go straight to Ryan out of spite. Jenna nodded, and I left, feeling the weight of what I'd just agreed to. That night was one of the hardest I'd ever endured. I couldn't listen to the tape until Sarah was asleep, so I played the part of the loving husband, just as I had for the past few days. She was still a little buzzed from her afternoon with Jenna, mentioning she'd had a lot of wine and was feeling affectionate. After dinner, she pulled me toward the bedroom, hinting that she was in the mood for something special. The irony wasn't lost on me. I wondered if this would be the last time we'd be together this way. Still clinging to a sliver of hope that Jenna might have been lying, I went along with her. But for me, it wasn't really making love. My heart and mind were in turmoil, and no amount of closeness could shake that. We held each other for a while afterward, only to repeat the act a few minutes later. Eventually, she fell asleep beside me, snoring softly, and I slipped out of the room, retreating to the guest room to finally listen to the tape. The recording started with light-hearted chatter between Jenna and Sarah, with Jenna ensuring their wine glasses stayed full. After a bit, Jenna began her act, telling Sarah she had something to get off her chest. She told her all about her fling with Caleb, though it was obvious that Sarah already knew the basics and was just enjoying the extra details. Jenna played her role well, laughing about how Caleb wasn't her first. Apparently, she'd had a fling with some guy named Ellis before he moved away. Sarah laughed, feigning shock but clearly enjoying the scandalous story. These details only confirmed what I already knew about Jenna's character and would make it easier to convince Ryan later. As much as I wanted to fast forward, I forced myself to listen until Jenna steered the conversation towards Sarah's affair. She asked, giggling, for more details about Liam and his supposed impressive attributes. My whole body tensed when I heard Sarah's laughter as she described him, calling him amazing, and adding that he was the biggest she'd ever seen. She joked that she'd initially doubted he'd fit inside her, sending both of them into fits of laughter. I stopped the tape, slumping back in my chair, overwhelmed by the brutal truth. My marriage was as good as over. Part of me didn't want to hear anymore, even considering handing the tape over to my lawyer and letting him deal with the rest. But I pushed play again, knowing I had to confront it all if I was going to figure out my next steps. Jenna pressed her, asking how the affair had started. Sarah admitted that she'd never intended to cheat on me and that she felt terrible about it. She mentioned how happy we'd always been and how even she couldn't quite believe she'd gone through with it. She attributed it to a case of BDF, a term that made her laugh as she promised to explain it to Jenna after another glass of wine. She went on, saying she'd been visiting the health club for a couple of years, mostly to stay in shape and keep me interested, worried about the signs of aging. Sarah explained that a few months back, she started noticing a new trainer at the gym, Liam. She described him as attractive, with broad shoulders and impressive muscles, and mentioned that he was flirtatious with women. She recalled seeing him chatting quietly with a former coworker, Aaron O'Connor. She watched Aaron disappear into Liam's office, and later, in the locker room, Aaron emerged looking flushed, dreamy-eyed, and more than a little pleased. Sarah said she greeted Aaron, noticing her glowing demeanor. Aaron laughed and admitted she was dealing with BTF, big tool fever. She giggled, looking around to make sure no one could hear, and then went into a few choice details about her experiences with Liam, especially praising his physical attributes and prowess. According to Aaron, Liam had wooed her, eventually luring her into his office, and they'd started a regular fling right there at the gym. Aaron was clearly thrilled, calling it the wildest intimacy she'd ever had. Sarah said she was intrigued but hadn't considered acting on it herself. Aaron was single, recently divorced, and free to do as she liked. But over the next few weeks, Sarah admitted she started paying more attention to Liam's flirtations. Whenever he touched her shoulder or brushed against her while helping with the equipment, she responded a little more openly. Sarah recounted a particular workout session when she was alone, bench pressing in a nearly empty area, and Liam had stationed himself just behind her, spotting her. She looked up and saw his shorts hovering above her, with a noticeable bulge. She admitted she couldn't believe how sizable he looked, and he apparently noticed her staring, grinning down at her knowingly. Sarah said she almost lost control of the bar, but somehow managed to finish her reps. As she went to put the bar back, Liam took her hand off it and slid it gently over his shorts, letting her feel for herself. She claimed she was in a bit of a daze as he took her hand and led her into his office, locking the door behind them. Without a word, he pulled down his shorts and stood in front of her, and as she put it, she wasn't thinking. What followed was intense, leaving her exhausted and overwhelmed. At this point, Jenna gave an impressed, "Wow," genuinely surprised. Jenna assumed Sarah must have continued seeing him. Sarah explained that after that first encounter, she was stunned, drifting into the shower feeling shaky and filled with guilt. She cleaned herself up and went home, feeling terrified I might pick up on something, but I hadn't noticed. She was actually relieved when I didn't suspect anything. She even avoided intimacy with me that night, worried I'd sensed the change. The next evening, she went all out to show her affection, probably as a way to ease her conscience. Sarah confessed that after the incident, she stayed away from the gym for 2 weeks, fearing she wouldn't be able to resist him again. Eventually, she convinced herself it had been a one-time mistake. She thought she was strong enough to keep her distance, reasoning that she was a grown woman with a loving husband. But when she went back, Liam quickly reignited the spark, catching her at the bench one day when no one was around. This time, he didn't need much effort to lure her back into his office. Jenna asked if Sarah continued seeing him after that, and Sarah admitted she had. She claimed that although she deeply valued the connection between us, something about the secrecy and danger of the affair had fueled a physical thrill she couldn't ignore. She revealed she'd been meeting him regularly, 2 to 3 times a week, and hadn't felt compelled to stop. In a way, she said, the secret even made her appreciate our own intimacy more. Hearing all of this cut deep, here I was, the man who'd loved her unconditionally, who took his vows seriously, while she'd been sneaking around with some guy she didn't even care about emotionally, purely for physical kicks. I sat through the remainder of the tape, but there wasn't much left. After the initial excitement, Liam had become more of a regular fling, one she could visit whenever she wanted another thrill. Sarah described feeling guilty, yet that thrill seemed to keep her going back. When I finished listening, it was around 2:30 a.m. My heart felt like stone. I was done with this marriage. I couldn't bring myself to share a bed with her, or even pretend anymore. I went back to the bedroom quietly, gathered clothes for the next day without waking her, and decided I'd be up and gone early. I left a brief, impersonal note, saying I had an early call and wouldn't be home until late. I made sure to keep it cold, not revealing anything. The night before, I'd already made 2 copies of the tape at the office, preparing for what was to come. By 8:30, I was on the phone with Mark, my best friend from college, who now worked at a downtown law firm. I asked for a favor, to set me up with the toughest, most ruthless divorce lawyer in his firm. He went quiet, clearly shocked, then apologized for what I was going through. After a quick conversation, Mark led me into the office of Laura Chandler, a lead partner known for her intimidating presence. Mark had once described her as the kind of person even sharks would steer clear of. Her firm handshake and focused gaze gave me an immediate sense of relief, knowing she'd be fighting on my side, not Sarah's. I played part of the tape for Laura and Mark, and after the first few moments, Laura had her assistant hold all calls. We sat in silence when the recording finished, until Laura broke it with a simple, "Okay, what do you want?" I told her I wanted a divorce based on infidelity, not a vague, irreconcilable differences. I was prepared to split our savings fairly, but I insisted on keeping the house and wanted Sarah to go back to her maiden name. I felt she no longer deserved to be Mrs. Ethan Blake. Laura nodded, eyeing me thoughtfully before asking for a moment alone with Mark to discuss the case details. 5 minutes later, I was back in her office, and Laura was ready to proceed. She assured me that the divorce would likely go through smoothly, as Sarah would have little room to argue. However, she pointed out that the recording wouldn't hold up in court since Sarah hadn't known she was being recorded. I grimaced and explained the mess with my sister-in-law Jenna's involvement, her own infidelity, and the contents of the first part of the tape. I mentioned I'd have to tell my brother Ryan, knowing it would devastate him. Half-jokingly, I suggested Laura might have a second divorce to handle soon. She exchanged a glance with Mark before refocusing on me. We listened to the section with Jenna on the tape, and after another private discussion between Laura and Mark, she commented dryly, "Quite the pair of wives you two ended up with." Seeing my expression, she quickly apologized, acknowledging her comment was out of line. Laura then explained that while the tape might not be admissible against Sarah, Jenna could be subpoenaed to testify about what Sarah had told her. That alone would be enough to apply pressure, and once Sarah's attorney got wind of the tape, he'd likely avoid a fight. As for my brother's case, she assured me the tape would hold since Jenna had been aware of the recording. She predicted Ryan's divorce would be straightforward if he wasn't unreasonable. Then she mentioned the possibility of a lawsuit against the health club and Liam. While Liam probably didn't have much in the way of assets, the club would be eager to settle to avoid a scandal. Mark and Laura estimated that we could likely secure a substantial settlement, possibly in the range of high six figures, or even $1 million or more. She pointed out that they'd never risk such a story going public. Imagine the cancellations from angry husbands across town. She let out a brief, humorless laugh, her sharp gaze unwavering. Laura promised to get the divorce documents underway, and Mark escorted me out of the office, apologizing again and promising Laura would handle everything. I thanked him, attempting a half-hearted smile. "Don't worry, Mark. This just means you and I will have more time for tennis." After expressing my gratitude, I left. The rest of the day, I kept myself busy with the practical details. I arranged for a locksmith to meet me at the house by 4:30. I made dinner plans with Ryan so I wouldn't be around when Sarah came home. I canceled her credit cards, set up separate accounts, and spent some time trying to write a goodbye letter. It took several attempts. Saying goodbye to the love of your life, even after betrayal, isn't easy. When I finally finished, I placed it in an envelope addressed to Sarah and took it to the house. The locksmith was done by 5:15, and I sat with a beer in the quiet kitchen, gathering my thoughts. Then I taped the letter to the front door, locked up, and left. I knew she'd be home between 6 and 6:30, and I wondered how she'd react. Would she try her key first, or read the note right away? I had laid it all out in that letter, telling her that our marriage was over, and she was now free to pursue Liam all she wanted. I explained that I'd had the locks changed, and if she wanted to collect her things, she'd need to arrange it with my attorney. I'd left Laura's name and number, instructing Sarah to contact her for supervised access to the house when I wasn't there. I made it clear that I wouldn't be speaking with her again. I ended the note by telling her she'd broken my heart, that I had loved her as deeply as any man could love a woman and had looked forward to growing old together. But apparently, our vows hadn't meant as much to her as a few reckless moments with Liam. At dinner with Ryan, he sensed something was off almost immediately. Once we placed our orders, I took a deep breath and told him the truth. Sarah had been cheating on me, and I decided to file for divorce. His face registered pure shock, mouth open, something I'd never seen from him before. Ryan looked at me, stunned. "Oh my God, Ethan. Sarah? Are you sure?" He caught himself, realizing how obvious the answer was, and apologized for the foolish question. He could see the truth in my face. After a pause, he asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I did. I poured out the hurt and betrayal over dinner, grateful to have my best friend by my side. The beers helped a little, but having Ryan's support meant everything. Near the end of the meal, I hesitated, then mentioned there was more he needed to know. "There's one part one haven't told you," I began. "It was Jenna who got me the proof. She recorded a conversation with Sarah, and that's how I found out." Ryan looked at me, his expression filled with sympathy. He said he was sorry for what I was going through and admitted he felt lucky to have someone as wonderful as Jenna. He added that he wasn't surprised she'd helped me out, saying she'd always seemed to care about me, even though I hadn't always seen her in the best light. Then he began praising Jenna, saying what a good wife she was to him, and I couldn't take it anymore. "Ryan, hold on," I interrupted. "Don't say anything else. Let me cover the bill, and then I need you to come back to my place with me." When we got to the house, I found a note under the screen door in Sarah's handwriting. I didn't read it, just tossed it onto the hall table and led Ryan to the guest room. I told him how much he meant to me, our friendship, our bond, and he looked back at me, a bit wary. He wasn't used to me talking like this. I told him I needed him to listen to the tape Jenna had recorded and suggested he sit down while I set it up. I rewound the tape, handed him the recorder, and left him alone to listen. A few minutes later, I heard murmured voices from the tape and then a crash. Ryan was pacing, muttering in anger as he listened to the whole thing. When it finally ended, he stormed into the kitchen, furious. He accused me of enjoying the situation, letting him praise Jenna without telling him the truth. He said I must have loved seeing him in the dark, especially since I'd never liked her. I stood up, meeting his anger with my own, and demanded, "Do you think I wanted any of this?" My voice was firm, and eventually, his shoulders sagged, his fists unclenched, and he sank down at the table, looking worn out. After a moment, he apologized, saying, "Sorry, Ethan. I know you're going through hell too. It's just, I can't believe you knew about this. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I kept my tone gentle. "You know how you were about Jenna, Ryan? You would have never believed me. Remember that fight we had when I said something about how she treated Mom? I found out about Jenna a week ago and knew I had to let you hear it for yourself. I only got the tape yesterday." We stayed up late, finishing off a few more beers as I walked him through the whole story. From the moment I saw Jenna with Caleb at the restaurant, to the deal she offered me, to the recording, and finally my meeting with Laura Chandler. I mentioned that she was handling my divorce and would be glad to represent him if he wanted. "Laura says our cases are pretty solid," I added. Ryan nodded, worn out, and crashed in my guest room. He couldn't bring himself to face Jenna. The phone rang several times that night, but we ignored it. Eventually, I just took it off the hook. Over the next few days, and then weeks, Sarah tried to reach me, leaving messages, crying and begging to talk, but I didn't respond. She showed up at my office a few times, but I'd arranged for the receptionist to warn me, and I'd leave before she could find me. A couple of times, I spotted her car parked outside the house when I got home, so I'd just drive by and wait until she left. Laura Chandler did her job well. She served the divorce papers, navigated the legal hurdles Sarah's lawyer threw at us, and soon we had a court date set. At first, Sarah's lawyer claimed there was no infidelity, but when Laura sent over a copy of the tape, that story changed quickly. They pivoted to saying the tape was inadmissible. Laura didn't even acknowledge that argument. She just stayed quiet, and as the court date approached, Sarah's lawyer asked Laura to discuss a settlement. The day after hearing the tape, Ryan moved out of his apartment with Jenna and into my guest room. He'd waited until she left, then called me, and we packed up everything he wanted in under 2 hours. He didn't want to see her or hear anything she had to say. He just wanted out. I noticed his eyes glisten with tears, and I looked away, knowing all too well how he felt. Jenna left a few angry, cursing messages on my home phone, a sharp contrast to Sarah's remorseful ones. After a day or two, I began screening my messages, deleting any as soon as I heard Jenna or Sarah's voices. Jenna tried reaching out to Ryan at work, even sending letters, but he never responded. With Laura handling his divorce as well, Ryan and I just let her manage everything. To my surprise, the lawsuits against Liam and the health club wrapped up first. The case against Liam fell flat. he'd vanished without a trace. But the health club, keen to dodge any bad press, agreed to a $1.1 million settlement. I signed a confidentiality agreement and walked away with a check that felt surreal, all within 10 weeks. Ryan was my rock, and I was his. We lived like a pair of bachelors, eating out, catching a ball game now and then, or just sitting around with a few beers, talking through it all. We talked about Jenna and Sarah, about the good times we'd had, and even joked about the possibility of decent women still out there waiting for us. It was hard to fully believe it, but having each other's support made a difference. I could see plainly that Ryan's failed marriage had nothing to do with him. Jenna had simply been selfish, thinking only of herself. And he reassured me that Sarah's cheating was more about her issues than anything I'd done wrong. Whether we truly believed each other, I don't know, but it helped to hear it. Ryan's divorce was finalized first. He refused to speak to Jenna, and Laura handled everything on his behalf. She mentioned Jenna initially tried to get more money, but ultimately had no leverage with the recording. The day Ryan had to sign the papers, I went with him. Jenna had already signed. He gave a strained smile, shook Laura's hand, and headed to the men's room. I could hear him crying through the door. 3 weeks later, it was my turn. We met in Laura's office with Sarah and her lawyer to finalize a settlement. Her lawyer agreed to terms with 2 conditions: that I drop the infidelity claim and meet with Sarah privately before we signed the papers. I told Laura I was willing to see Sarah, but not to drop the infidelity grounds. Eventually, we agreed I'd let Sarah try to persuade me. A part of me, maybe the part that loved her for so long, wanted to hear what she had to say. When I entered the conference room, she was waiting in a blue dress she knew I'd always loved. Her hair was shorter, and despite looking pale, she was still the beautiful woman I'd loved for years. I kept my face neutral, trying to calm my pounding heart, and told her, "All right, it's your meeting. Just 2 things, though. Don't tell me you love me, and don't tell me it was just sex." She flushed, tears welling up. "Ethan, I'm so sorry, but how can I not say those things? I made a terrible mistake. Stupid, thoughtless. I hurt you, but it was just a moment of weakness, a stupid impulse. I've replayed it in my head 1,000 times, wishing I'd never done it." "Yes, but you did do it, didn't you?" I kept my tone steady, determined not to let her off easy. Just being in the same room with her, knowing this was our final conversation and why, broke my heart all over again. I turned to the window to hide my face as she cried softly behind me. "It meant nothing, you know. It was the most foolish, hurtful thing I could have done, but it had nothing to do with how much I love you," she murmured. I let her talk, that familiar, pleading tone filling the room. Her voice was still as sweet as ever, but every word felt predictable. Nothing she said made a difference. Eventually, I turned back, sitting down directly across from her. I took a deep breath and said, "For what it's worth, I still love you. But it's over. You took from me, from us, the most precious thing we had besides love, the trust between us. How could I ever be with you again? Wondering if you're thinking of me or of him. How could I live with you? Wondering where you are if you're 10 minutes late. Wondering if you've found another big tool to fool around with." She had no answer, just more tears. Eventually, between her sobs, she managed, "Please, baby, please. Couldn't you give me one more chance? And I'll give you a moment to think about what happened next." I looked at Sarah and asked, "What if I'd met some random woman with a knockout body and had a fling on the side for a few weeks? Someone I didn't even respect or care about. Just someone who gave me a level of pure physical pleasure that I'd never gotten with you. And then you found out about it. Could you stay with me? Could you get past the hurt and betrayal? Could you overcome those insecurities, wondering if you'd ever really be the one I wanted?" She met my gaze, her eyes full of sadness. "I don't need to think about it," she said. "I've been thinking about it for weeks. Could I forgive you? Could I take you back if the roles were reversed? No, I couldn't. I wouldn't be able to get over it." She took a shaky breath. "But I'm asking you to do what I couldn't, to be braver and stronger than me. Please give me a chance to make it up to you, to spend my life showing you how sorry I am and how much I love you." We sat in silence, just looking at each other, remembering everything we'd shared and how we'd ended up here. I stood slowly, filled with anger toward her, but also with self-hatred for letting it come to this. I don't know if I can't do it or if I just won't, I said finally, but I'm not that braver, stronger person you want me to be. Goodbye. I waited by the door, giving her a chance to say one last thing. But she only hung her head, crying softly. Laura was waiting for me down the hall, a surprisingly sympathetic look on her normally stern face. Just let her have irreconcilable differences, I muttered. Doesn't matter to me anymore. Later, Ryan and I sat at my kitchen table, a few beers in, though we weren't drunk. I cleared my throat and said, I've been making some plans. He nodded, listening as I continued. After all the lawyer fees, I still have almost $800,000 left from the settlement. I invested most of it in safe spots, so we've got a nice nest egg waiting for us down the line. But I set aside $50,000 for the Ethan and Ryan Blake Recovery Fund, and we're going to start using it. I booked us 4 weeks in a condo in Cancun, starting in 2 weeks. Tell your boss you're taking time off because we're going to live it up for a while. 2 carefree bachelors, a couple of newly single guys. He raised an eyebrow, and I laughed. No, not like that. I mean, carefree as in we're done moping around, whining about how we've been screwed over. Cancun turned out to be a blast, or at least as much of one as it could be for 2 guys nursing broken hearts. We soaked up the sun, played tennis, swam, and indulged in a few too many drinks, though we made sure to keep each other in check. As the days passed, we got tanner, a bit fitter, and further from the mess we'd left behind. And Ryan, despite what Jenna had done to him, managed to regain his old confidence, charming and charismatic as ever. His favorite move was to spot 2 attractive women at a table, drag me over, and say with a big grin, Ladies, I know you wouldn't let a stranger buy you a drink, so let me introduce my brother, Ethan Blake. Then I'd jump in, as the shy one, saying, Pleased to meet you both. This is my brother, Ryan Blake. Ryan would nod, pretending to be relieved, and add, Glad we got that out of the way. Now, may we buy you a drink? By that point, the women would usually be laughing or at least smiling, and we'd end up with their company for the evening. Sometimes, the company lasted until breakfast. Plenty of the women were in Cancun for the same reason we were, to forget, to have fun, to keep things light. Over those weeks, I ended up with 6 different women in my bed, and I suspect Ryan's count was a bit higher. It was mostly casual, just fun and laughter. The first couple of times, I was hesitant, distracted by thoughts of Sarah and her affair with Liam. It was hard to push the images out of my mind, but the women didn't seem to notice, and each time it got a little easier. One-night stands aren't for everyone, but for Ryan and me, they were what we needed at the time. Only one of those women stood out, Kelly, a tall Irish redhead a year younger than me. We did the usual things, drinks, laughter, dinner, dancing, and eventually back to my place. She was warm, responsive, and I found myself as eager to be with her as she was with me. But things changed later that night, around 3 a.m. I woke up and lay there in the dark, Kelly breathing softly beside me, and all my thoughts of Sarah came rushing back. The memories, everything we'd had together, and everything that had been shattered. Before I knew it, I was crying quietly. Kelly woke up, noticed, and knelt beside me, holding me in her arms, whispering, It's all right, love. Let it out. I was embarrassed but couldn't stop. She held me until the tears slowed, and finally, with her gentle encouragement, I told her the whole story. By the time I'd finished, the sun was coming up. We moved to the kitchen, and as I made breakfast, she shared her own story. Kelly shared that her own divorce had been less dramatic. No cheating, just a husband who had grown increasingly distant, more wrapped up in his career until their marriage had become empty. She'd been on her own for nearly 2 years. After breakfast, we found our way back to the bedroom in comfortable silence, and we made love. The night before had been just casual fun, exciting and friendly. This time, though, it felt different, intimate. We looked into each other's eyes, whispered softly, and discovered a whole new level of connection. My one-night stand with Kelly became 4 wonderful nights together. When she finally left, I could tell Ryan was a bit concerned. He encouraged me to meet new women and keep moving forward. I acknowledged that Kelly had been special, and he agreed, saying he liked her too. But he reminded me that she'd gone home, and we still had 10 days left in Cancun. He dragged me out for some tennis, then to the pool, and by evening, we were chatting with two secretaries from San Francisco who were on their first trip abroad. They returned to their own room that night, but the next afternoon, one of them, Lucy, joined me in mine. After Cancun, Ryan and I settled back into our lives. 8 months had passed, and although he'd moved into a great new apartment, we still spent plenty of time together. One evening, as we were out for dinner, Ryan leaned over the table and quietly mentioned that two couples had just been seated across the room, and one of them included Sarah. I took a deep breath, letting my heartbeat settle, and after a few seconds, turned around to glance at her. She had already noticed me, meeting my gaze steadily. I gave her a polite, non-committal smile and wave, which she returned with a small smile of her own, before I turned back to Ryan and resumed our conversation. Ryan asked if this was the first time I'd seen her since the divorce, and I nodded, admitting that I hadn't expected to feel such a rush of emotion. The surprise of it caught me off guard. I asked Ryan if we could just enjoy our dinner without mentioning anything about her. No observations, no comments about who she was with or how she looked. He agreed easily and launched into a funny story about a coworker who'd been flirting with him at work. He wasn't interested, but he found the back and forth entertaining. As we lingered over coffee and watched couples dancing, I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard her voice. I stood to greet Sarah, taken off guard once more. She asked if I'd like to dance, just for old time's sake, and I agreed. As we moved together, old memories washed over me. Her warmth, her beauty, the memories of happier times. We made small talk, chatting about work and the weather, but eventually fell quiet, both lost in thought. I felt a bittersweet ache as I realized that those moments together were now only memories. Near the end of the dance, Sarah pulled back to look me in the eyes and asked how I'd been. I didn't know her the truth, but I chose to be honest. I told her I was all right managing. Some days were better than others. I admitted that seeing her and dancing together brought back strong feelings I hadn't expected. Sarah's expression grew serious as she confessed that she wasn't as all right as she appeared. She missed me daily, and being close to me again had stirred things she thought she'd left behind. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent as the music drifted to an end. She hesitated before letting go, then asked if I ever wondered whether I'd made the right choice. She admitted she still thought about us constantly, often questioning why I'd made what she called the wrong decision. Later, when I dropped Ryan off, he asked if I was okay. I reassured him, knowing encounters like this were inevitable in a town our size. We confirmed plans for tennis the next day, and I headed home. Once in my dim bedroom, as I quietly undressed, she rolled over, asking how my evening with Ryan had gone. I told her about the strange run-in, reflecting that maybe it had been for the best that she hadn't been there. She gave me a gentle smile and asked if I'd hold her for a bit. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her soft kisses along my neck, breathing in her familiar scent. In that moment, I realized that life was moving forward in ways I hadn't imagined.